In our lives there's a time a-coming when all the world seems lost and torn. In our lives there's a time a-coming when all around
Recording in progress.
In our lives there's a time a-coming when all the world seems lost and torn. In our lives there's a time a-coming when all around is scorn. In our lives there's a time a-coming when glory could be born. So you're wondering, girl, is trouble here to stay? There's a new world coming your way.
Welcome to the Wilmette Institute's first webinar at the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. I'm Chitra Golestani, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Associate Director of the Wilmette Institute, an online institution that draws on principles from the Baha'i Faith to inspire sustained social change. The Wilmette Institute is the sixth affiliate at the Graduate Theological Union's consortium and is pleased to be a part of the GTU community. Due to the conditions around the pandemic, it was not easy to have a large gathering of this size in person, but we really look forward to doing so in the near future. Now I have the pleasure of introducing a scholar activist I highly admire. Dr. Derik Smith is a professor in the Department of Literature at Claremont McKenna College. He is currently the chair of the Department of Africana Studies at the Claremont Colleges. His work is anchored in the analysis of American culture and particularly African American literary culture. He is the author of many articles and the book Robert Hayden in Verse, New Histories of African American Poetry and the Black Arts Era, which won the College Language Association's annual book award. Dr. Smith regularly teaches courses in American prisons and nurtures interest in prison studies and pedagogy. If you're interested in that topic, I highly recommend you check out the webinar he did called Supplanting the Prison Industrial Complex. He and his family live in Southern California, and we are delighted to have him with us today for this webinar, Reimagining the Construction of Blackness, from Anti-Blackness to World Unity. Without further ado, Dr. Smith.
Thank you so much, Dr. Golestani. I really appreciate it. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with everyone. I have put together a presentation that is about a key metaphor in the revelation of Baha'u'llah. And from the revelation of Baha'u'llah emerges the Baha'i Faith. And I'll just say a few words about the Baha'i Faith for those of you who may not know about it. It's the faith that I follow, and it's an independent world religion structured around the, as I said, the divine revelation of one Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri, who's known as Baha'u'llah, meaning the glory of God in Arabic. He was born in 1817 to a noble family in Persia, but lived most of his life as an exile and prisoner in the western reaches of the Ottoman Empire during its final years. So I'll be referring to Baha'u'llah throughout my presentation. And I guess, like, in order to fully grasp the consequence of the ideas that I'm trying to unfold here, I think it's key to understand that Baha'is believe that Baha'u'llah is nothing less than a manifestation of God, the figure who represents the divine message to humanity appropriate for this day and age. And so the metaphor that I'll be looking at in this presentation is really from the perspective of a Baha'i, coming from the voice of God. So that gives it a kind of power and gravitas that I think is kind of consequential and necessary to understand for the kind of exegesis that I do here. So the vast social and spiritual order that emerges from Baha'u'llah's revelation now patterns the life of about 5 to 6 million peoples, Baha'is throughout the world, and who believe that this revelation constitutes a divine framework capable of and wholly devoted to unifying all humanity in a harmonious and just social order. So let me share my screen here. For the purposes of this presentation, I have a few slides. They're not that great, but they go along with what I'm trying to talk about here. And, you know, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll leave aside many questions about the theology that's laid out in the revelation of Baha'u'llah. And instead, as I said, I'm going to consider the remarkable way in which Baha'u'llah accorded in his sacred order a special spiritual status to Black people by designating them as the pupil of the eye of humanity, through which the light of the Spirit shineth forth. And I'll consider some of the implications of this pupil of the eye metaphor and explain why I think that this minor note in the vast symphony of Baha'u'llah's revelation is such an integral part of his vision for the unification of all humanity. So for 21st century organizers and intellectuals addressing issues of racial justice, best praxis often involves centering the experiences of those most marginalized by social power. This challenging principle demands that any project of social transformation prioritizes the predicaments and perspectives of groups with the least amount of cultural, social, and economic capital. Prioritizing consideration of such groups is, of course, antithetical to the mainstream of social thought and shakes the very foundation of hegemonic world order, which is, to a certain degree, is stabilized by systematic devaluation of the most marginalized and the least capitalized. And because rhetorical and practical attempts to implement this principle of centering the most marginalized predictably meet strong resistance, those now at the forefront of secular movements for racial justice in the United States and elsewhere are often adamant in their effort to call attention to the most marginalized people who are often Black. At first blush, this adamancy can appear parochial and even ethnocentric, like, why must Black lives matter? Why can't all lives matter? However, the logic of centering the most marginalized is ultimately universalist. Angela Davis explains that in this approach to social action, quote, universal freedom is an ideal best represented not by those who are already at the pinnacle of racial, gender, and class hierarchies, but rather by those whose lives are most defined by conditions of unfreedom. With racial specificity, Alicia Garza succinctly unpacks the tactical logic of the Black Lives Matter movement that she helped to spark by saying, when Black people get free, everybody gets free. The strategies of social transformation offered by these racial justice activists don't perfectly mirror those being implemented by Baha'is throughout the world. There are certainly differences in the strategies. However, the rationale of these initiatives that foreground the predicament of the most marginal have resonance with the followers and students of the Universalist project, the universal project of social and spiritual transformation laid out in the revelation of Baha'u'llah. Indeed, the explicit centering of Black life, which is called for by contemporary theorists and activists, was anticipated, I would argue, by Baha'u'llah's 19th century emphasis on the special spiritual station and capacity of Black people. In his global proclamation, pivoting on the principle of the oneness of humanity, Baha'u'llah accorded colored people, in the parlance of that era, a particularly hallowed and central position in the figurative body of humanity. In the latter half of the 19th century, Baha'u'llah declared that Black people were appropriately comparable to the Black pupil of the eye, through which the light of the spirit shineth forth. This selection of metaphor, often referred to by central figures and institutions of the Baha'i Faith, effectively positions Blackness at the epicenter of a world transformative project that involves nothing less, Baha'is believe, than the coming of age of the entire human race. Baha'u'llah's revelation offers few, if any, analogous designations which isolate and favor a racialized subset of humanity. Thus, this specific reference to Black peoples constitutes a noteworthy moment in his sacred system. Explanations of the importance and potential meaning of the people of the eye reference have been outlined by scholars who primarily have examined the deployment of the metaphor as a means of building an egalitarian, interracial religious community in the beginning of the early 20th century, primarily in North America. Here, I want to extend those explorations by proposing a number of interpretive possibilities organized around two interrelated claims. First, by giving Black people a principal position in the figurative body of humanity, Baha'u'llah's metaphor is reflective of the material reality that Black people were among the principal builders of global modernity, a reality that has been obscured in scholarly and lay discourse for some centuries, but which is becoming increasingly prominent in the work of influential historians. Second, by favoring Black people through the pupil of the eye metaphor, Baha'u'llah produced a rupture in what we might call racial epistemology of the 19th century. And it's one that rupture distinguishes the world transformative project of his revelation from social reformist movements of the era. And it was critical, I think, to the establishment of the principle of the oneness of mankind, which is the pivot around which all the teachings of Baha'u'llah revolve. Now, it's difficult to offer up a concrete and static definition of Blackness. In other versions of this material, I try to define the construct with some precision, but for now, I'll submit that the Black people referred to in the pupil of the eye metaphor are all those people of African descent who became Black in the context of modernity. Of course, it is also I mean, I have to sort of maybe back up and sort of talk about the way in which, of course, Blackness is a construct that has appeared with the meanings that it has in many of the meanings that it takes on in the current day. This has only been around for several centuries, right? It was a construct that came up through the transatlantic slave trade, but I'll get into that a little bit more. And it comes up within the context of modernity, but it's also hard to crisply define the phenomena of modernity that has produced race and Blackness. But we might think of it as the cultural, political, philosophical, and technological developments that have emerged from the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, and that have thoroughly shaped the material world in recent centuries. There are some aspects of this bundle of ideas worth underscoring when considering Baha'u'llah's people of the eye metaphor. One is that although modernity is often simplistically linked to the West, it has ramified throughout the world. And another thing to keep in mind is that some have regarded modernity as a cataclysmic worldwide ramification because Western modernity has wrought devastation for some and has consistently created what one calls antonymic and problematic others, groups of stigmatized people unworthy of social and civic honor and protection. Indeed, it can be argued that Blackness is nothing more and nothing less than the stigma that modernity has projected onto people deemed to be its most antonymic and problematic others. This is not to say that Blackness is always and everywhere a stigma, or that those who embrace Black identity are embracing stigma. Rather, I mean to say that in the context of now global modernity, Blackness is inextricably bound to its origin as a racial classification meant to facilitate the exclusion of others from the protected community. Whatever else Blackness may be, in the period since the emergence of modernity, it has also been an antonym of the sacred community, the sign of the excluded other. Through the pupil of the eye metaphor, then, Baha'u'llah wrestles with and radically transforms the meaning of a major symbol of modernity. If modernity conjured Blackness to fragment humanity and marginalize and exploit those bearing its mark, Baha'u'llah's metaphor alters the meaning of Blackness, drawing it to the center of the body of humanity and imbuing it with a positive connotation. For the most part, scholars have figured the pupil of the eye reference as a refutation of chauvinisms, as well as a means by which Baha'u'llah conferred new racial identity to Black people and furnished an effective psychological antidote to prevailing social stereotypes. And this is surely an important social function of this scriptural metaphor that fills its tenor. So a metaphor has a tenor and a vehicle. Black people is the tenor, right? And it fills Black people with the qualities of the vehicle, which is the pupil of the eye. And that consequently brings honor and esteem to a segment of humanity that was subject to some of the most dishonoring and stigmatizing discourses of modernity. However, before tracing out some of the implications of the purely instrumental purposes of Baha'u'llah's 19th century metaphor, and instrumental, I mean, by instrument, it's an instrument by which Black people are lifted up. It's important to recognize that the metaphor was not only an instrument that would elevate the social status of Black people. The metaphor, I would say, is also instructional. It was the articulation of some truth that the divine educator wanted to teach the world. Indeed, the instrumental purpose of the metaphor, an elevated regard for Black life, only gains traction if the instructional purpose of the metaphor is contemplated and accepted. But it must be acknowledged that the precise truth that is taught by the metaphor is difficult to pin down. It may be understood that Black people are like the pupil of the eye, but how so? In what way? The literal relationship between the vehicle and the tenor of the metaphor is apparent. Black people have more melanin in the skin than other races and thus are darker than other peoples, just as the pupil is darker than other parts of the eye. The chromatic likeness shared by tenor and vehicle makes the metaphor resonant. But the figuration only becomes instructional when the physiological qualities of the people are considered. By likening Black people to a key apparatus in the physiological system that creates vision, Baha'u'llah may have been teaching the world about the perceptive powers of Black people. Perhaps he was suggesting that Black people possess insight into the human condition, insight achieved through collective suffering. If this is among the truths that Baha'u'llah conveyed through the people of the eye metaphor, it bears some similarity to well-known statements of W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1903 contended that Black people in America were gifted with second sight. Du Bois elaborated this claim in his most well-known book, The Souls of Black Folk, in which he attempted to describe in the somewhat mystical in his sort of telling of it, essence of African-American experience in his era. Thus, interpretations of the people of the eye metaphor that fix upon the spiritual perceptiveness of Black people are in keeping with a tradition. This interpretation is in keeping with a tradition of African-American thought that was significantly advanced by Du Bois and that attempted to alchemize a history of oppression into a source of pride and inspiration. As he would put it elsewhere in his writings, among American Negroes, there are sources of strength in common memories of suffering in the past. So Du Bois, in the early part of the 20th century, had a project for trying to imbue Blackness with a sense of pride. Du Bois and many following him in the 20th century deliberately encouraged racial pride among African Americans by suggesting that the race's tormented history had conferred upon it a special insight and ability. And of course, recognizing tests and trials as strengthening and spiritually ennobling is not without precedent. Any number of intellectual and spiritual traditions appeal to this framework as a mechanism for making sense of life's difficulties. Interpretations of the people of the eye metaphor that link spiritual insight to Black people because they have endured a history of torment takes this formula, which can give positive meaning to horrible events, and applies it to the racial collective. In this interpretive framework, the instrumental purpose of the metaphor, that is, elevating the social status of Black people, is accomplished when the instructional purpose of the metaphor, teaching that Black people have spiritual insight because of historical suffering, is understood. In its concentration on spiritual insight born out of hardship, this interpretation implicitly draws from a stream of African-American thought that flows through Du Bois and other early 20th century Black historians who sought to make the memory of slavery into a point of pride rather than a mark of shame. Now, in recent years, historians have started to think about the New World enslavement of Africans and African-descended people in ways that were intuited by Du Bois and his contemporaries. Just as Baha'u'llah gives Black people just as Baha'u'llah's metaphor gives Black people a central and vital role in the figurative body of humanity, a fresh form of historiography is showing that the story of modernity pivots on the contributions of Black people. Indeed, an influential cadre of 21st century scholars working in a subfield that has sometimes been dubbed New Histories of Capitalism, which I'll call NHC, are persuasively demonstrating that the labor of enslaved Black people was one of the primary catalytic forces in the emergence of industrialization and global capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. These scholars are overturning a tradition of historiography that has downplayed the significance of slavery in the rise of European and American power in the world and the ensuing efflorescence of global material prosperity. For NHC historians, the lives and labor of Black people are not mere addendums to the narrative that would explain the so-called, what is sometimes called the Great Divergence or the European miracle, through which Europe was catapulted and later America was catapulted ahead of the rest of humanity in terms of material well-being. Instead, in the Chronicle of Material Development offered by New Histories of Capitalism, Black people are the protagonists. This compelling and recently invigorated narrative insists that the explosion of prosperity in the modern world is not simplistically attributable to European and later American innovation, culture, governance, or advanced legal and property rights systems. Rather, it shows that the expropriative and exploitative New World plantation complex was at the heart of a transformative social and economic process that first allowed for the accumulation of vast wealth in European metropoles, and then sparked the Industrial Revolution, which in turn led to the exponential expansion of material development in the world. So, the network of agricultural plantations that first bloomed in the Caribbean basin of the 1500s and eventually spread throughout the Americas produced European capital liberation, as one scholar calls it, but was impossible without African labor enslavement. For a variety of reasons, histories of global development have marginalized the immeasurable role of African work in the creation of the modern world and its earth-girdling economy. But new histories of capitalism shows that the stolen labor of Black people was at the very center of the process of global integration and the takeoff that gave modern capitalism its fundamental structures of production and consumption. Among the primary proponents of this new history of capitalism in recent years is a Harvard professor, Sven Beckert, who argues that the cotton trade was the keystone in the first truly global market, which connected Africa, Europe, the Americas, and various parts of Asia in the 18th century, and that it served as the launching pad for the broader Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. In Beckert's telling, the center of the cotton empire moved from the east in India to the west in Great Britain only after Europeans were able to establish an economic dominance that was built on roughly 300 years of colonial enterprise in the New World. This enterprise, mostly focused on sugar production, was history-altering and essential to the flowering of not just global capitalism, but Western Enlightenment. It was also totally dependent on the labor of those described by Baha'u'llah as the pupil of the eye. The massive central role played by Black people in the material development of the modern world is manifest in one stark figure that is important to NHC scholarship. And that is, between 1492 and 1807, roughly the first 300 years of New World, what we call New World Modernity, 4 out of every 5 people who came from the Old World, Africa and Europe, to the New World, the Caribbean and the Americas, were African. That's 4 out of every 5 people who came from the Old World to the New World in the first 300 years of global modernity were African. These 6.5 million people prepared the land, grew the crops, and built the infrastructure that was a necessary precursor to the development of the 19th century global cotton market, a market that grew in leaps and bounds because of eventually mechanized production of textile made from white gold, cotton. During Baha'u'llah's lifetime, the great majority of the most lucrative and arguably most consequential commodity was grown and harvested in the United States by Black people. In 1853, a pro-slavery trade journal, the American Cotton Planter, published an editorial about the global cotton trade. The editorial was simultaneously nefarious and accurate. Its writer, a staunch advocate of slavery, rightly insisted that the cultivation and manufacturing of cotton was the commercial bond that linked Great Britain and the United States, and that cotton granted these nations the most powerful and productive economies in the mid-19th century world. But most important to an assessment of the instructive purpose of Baha'u'llah's pupil of the eye metaphor was the editorialist's implicit acknowledgement that the operations of the burgeoning economic world order would not be possible without Black people. While ignoring their humanity and attempting to justify slavery's systematic robbery of their life and labor, the writer nevertheless emphasized Black people's central role in the drama of a rapidly developing world economy. His unscrupulous defense of slavery in the United States rested upon a keen valuation of the enormously productive power of Black people who toiled in bondage. However distasteful it now appears, a weighty truth is felt in the lower frequencies of his claims that, quote, slave labor of the United States has hitherto conferred and is still conferring inappreciable blessings on mankind. This is what the writer of this editorial said. Continuing the theme, the editorialist argues that, quote, in the dispensation of an all-wise providence, the peculiar institution of the southern states contributes an indispensable support to human progress and prosperity. Couched in an apologia for slavery in the United States, these arguments advance a core premise of New Histories of Capitalism scholarship. That is, the rise of modern capitalism and its world transformative effects depended on unfree Black labor. Perhaps unexpectedly, these arguments also shed light on a viable interpretation of the instructional meaning of the pupil of the eye metaphor. By according Black people a central role, by according Black people a central and indispensable function in the figurative body of humanity, Baha'u'llah illustrated a material reality that was ruthlessly recognized by 19th century capitalists in the American South, but was and remains inappreciable to most. That is to say, through the pupil of the eye metaphor, Baha'u'llah instructed humanity about a fundamental historical truth. Black people played a central, indispensable role in the creation of the modern world and were precious contributors to the global prosperity that must someday redound to the benefit of all peoples. Anti-Black ideology became such a powerful and important part of modernity precisely because the stolen labor of Black people was so central to the building of the post-1492 world. Social theories of the West, from those of Karl Marx to Pierre Bourdieu, teach that exploitative and unequal power relations always require justificatory narratives. The massive human exploitation that was the predicate of New World modernity had to be reconciled with the moral frameworks of those who were doing the exploiting. As the labor and lives of millions of Black people were robbed through enslavement, there arose a massive ideological apparatus that sought to justify the robbery. This multifaceted and thoroughgoing apparatus, which can be called anti-Blackness, served to vigorously debase those colored people that Baha'u'llah would eventually uphold as pupil of the eye. The centuries-long exploitation of African and African-descended people who were central to the emergence of modernity and global capitalism was justified through the development of an array of stigmas focused on dishonoring Black bodies, cultures, minds, and even souls with an intensity that matched the massive scale of the exploitation that was at the heart of New World slavery. That is to say, New World slavery was this incredibly powerful and history-shaping project. It needed to have an ideology that matched its incredible scale. Therefore, the ideology of anti-Blackness is incredibly powerful and potent and long-lasting in its effects. From the 16th century onwards, many leaders of European and New World Christendom helped build anti-Black ideology through scriptural hermeneutics and racialized theologies that attributed a special sinfulness or even soullessness to Black people. But in the development of anti-Black ideologies, the Christian clerics were also joined by their more secular-minded rivals, the intellectuals or philosophes who were the pioneers of Enlightenment thought. By the time Baha'u'llah offered up the pupil of the eye metaphor, centering and honoring Black people, European and New World discourses of anti-Blackness were certainly circulating in his milieu, which was also alive with its own anti-Black ideology that justified the widespread enslavement of Africans in Qajar, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and elsewhere in the Islamic world. Recognizing the sharp distinction between Baha'u'llah's engagement with Black life and that of the contextualizing thought regimes of his era produces a deepened appreciation for the novelty, independence, and internal coherence of the social theory woven into his revelation. The instructive and instrumental purposes of the pupil of the eye metaphor contrast most sharply with the anti-Black litany produced by the avant-garde humanists associated with the Western Enlightenment. So there's a lot of anti-Blackness going on in this period of the 18th and 19th century. And in, of course, in Baha'u'llah's context, there is anti-Blackness as well. But what I'm going to focus in on here is that of the secular humanists of the Western Enlightenment, right? Because there's an irony in their anti-Blackness. Although the leading minds of this movement were committed to a new understanding of the human condition, an understanding meant to bring on prosperity, ease of life, and social amelioration, these hugely creative thinkers were, without exception, promulgators of anti-Blackness. It is perhaps ironic that the architecture of modernity's racism, reliant on the pseudoscientific construct of race, was designed even as the philosophers who were seminal to the Enlightenment simultaneously elevated the ideal of rationalism and empiricist methods of inquiry. Emerging from these ideals and methods was much of the intellectual blueprint for conceptions of democracy, egalitarianism, justice, religious tolerance, and freedom of thought that are frequently associated with the Enlightenment and that are vital to the contemporary world order. But in the influential writings and heady salons of the 17th and 18th century in Europe, seminal thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Denis Diderot, Voltaire, and a legion of lesser-known intellectuals were simultaneously disseminating subjective, pseudoscientific ideas about race, most of which were characterized by intense anti-Black sentiment dressed in the costumes of rational scientism. So while these thinkers, they may have quarreled over the morality of the Atlantic slave trade and the enslavement of Africans in European colonies of the New World, they had differences of opinion about the morality of the slave trade, but they were essentially unanimous in their lowest estimation of Black humanity. As Voltaire, for example, sought to dismantle what he thought of as irrational interpretations of the Genesis creation story, he concurrently built up the stigmatization of Blackness. And this is just one example to show how this was part and parcel of the Enlightenment project. Writing on African people, Voltaire would quip, "Our wise men have said that man was created in the image of God." Now here's a lovely image of the divine, a flat Black nose with little or hardly any intelligence. This sarcastic attack on both African humanity and the Christian clerical wisdom exemplifies the interconnection of Enlightenment scientism and anti-Black rhetoric. Voltaire's effort to advance rational secular inquiry about the origin of man was entwined with a subjective and degrading description of Black people. So it went. Anti-Black ideology was part and parcel of the Enlightenment project. It was like a viral attachment that spread along with literacy and the social and civic ideas that reshaped Europe and the Atlantic and the Mediterranean basins in the centuries before Baha'u'llah revealed his body of teachings. Against this backdrop, then, Baha'u'llah's intervention in the era's racial discourse amounts to nothing less, I would argue, than an epistemological rupture, the introduction of a radical ideological conception that had hardly any precedent in the secular or religious thinking of his historical moment. archivists will be hard-pressed to find a comparable elevation of colored people in the reams of philosophical and social writing produced in Baha'u'llah's lifetime during the 19th century. The absolute refusal of anti-Black ideology should be considered a distinguishing feature of Baha'u'llah's social teachings. It is a notable example of the coherence in what Baha'u'llah himself described as the wondrous system laid out in his revelation. This system was animated by one fundamental purpose, underscored time and again in his voluminous writings. It sought to, quote, safeguard the interests and promote the unity of the human race, and to foster the spirit of love and fellowship amongst men. The virulent anti-Blackness of his world historical moment was, of course, antithetical to the spirit of love and fellowship that Baha'u'llah aimed to promote through what some scholars have mistakenly called his reformist movement. But while scores of 18th and 19th century social reformers sought to advance the interests of the human race, even as they endorsed ideologies that debased and stigmatized Black people, Baha'u'llah's favoring of colored people took hold of prevailing racial epistemology and turned it on its head. This was not reform, it was rupture. And so in my argumentation, right, this is really important. To think of Baha'u'llah as a reformist is to debase his stature in my mind, right? If I'm thinking about Baha'u'llah as a divine messenger, right, he's something more than a simple social reformer. So therefore, I think one of the indications of this anomalous status, his difference from the social reformers of the era, is that his racial take, his approach to Blackness was so different from any of the other social reformers of his moment. It says remarkable. This was not reform, it was rupture, a rupture that was the prerequisite of any coherent program, ultimately seeking the unity of the human race. The widespread but tortured logic of social reformist movements that sought the betterment of humanity and simultaneously promoted or acquiesced to anti-Black ideology operates in stark contrast to the logic of Baha'u'llah's mission. In itself, the specific refusal of anti-Black ideology distinguishes Baha'u'llah's system from that of contemporaneous reform movements. It also speaks to the systemic integrity of the ethics of Baha'u'llah's revelation, the internal coherence of the system. Although it represents just one node in the expansive social and spiritual system activated in his revelation, Baha'u'llah's special promotion of the capacity of Black people is an outsized marker of the novelty and philosophical independence of his system. If the designation of the pupil of the eye operated as a radical refutation of anti-Blackness that was essential to the Western modernity that Baha'u'llah engaged in his revelation, this intervention cannot be easily attributed to the intellectual or social mores of his Islamic context. So it's not as though he was getting that from the Islamic context which he was raised in. Baha'u'llah's geographic and social environment was rife with its own forms of racism, which stigmatized the Black Africans who constituted a significant portion of the slave population in 19th century Persia and the Ottoman Empire. However, there's a difference between the anti-Blackness of the Ottoman and Persian empires and that crystallized in the modern West. The distinction between anti-Blackness in the proverbial West and East is sharpened by a kind of idea offered by historians who distinguish between slave societies and societies with slaves. While anti-Blackness of the West was the ideological handmaid of New World slave societies, in which slavery stood at the center of economic production and was the engine of enormous wealth production, the anti-Black sentiment of Baha'u'llah's Qajar and Ottoman context grew out of a society with slaves. In these societies with slaves were marginal to the central productive processes. The institution of slavery was somewhat porous, and enslaved or formerly enslaved people could sometimes ascend the social hierarchy even. Nevertheless, anti-Black sentiment was certainly a feature of the elite Persian matrix in which Baha'u'llah was raised in the early 19th century. Not only were enslaved Africans, often castrated eunuchs, commonplace in the household of the Persian nobility of the era, but by the time of Baha'u'llah's birth, this class of Persians, the noble class, was also beginning to emulate certain European social, cultural, and intellectual practices. It would be naive then to suggest that the well-established anti-Blackness of Western modernity didn't influence Qajar Persia and the Ottoman territories in which Baha'u'llah was exiled. I'm coming to the close here with one final thought about slavery and anti-Blackness. The revelation of Baha'u'llah's most holy book, his Book of Laws, in 1873, forbade the trade in slaves, and thus made known that in his dispensation, ownership of human beings was contrary to divine will. But it's important to disentangle Baha'u'llah's abrogation of the institution of slavery from his stand against anti-Black ideology. This law, the abrogation of slavery, was of course applicable to all humanity. It had no racial specificity. Indeed, in 19th century Qajar Persia and the Ottoman Empire, enslaved people hailed from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. The abolition of legal slavery, which was a worldwide evolution in the organization of human society, did not address racial ideologies that produced the abrogation of legal slavery, which happened throughout the world in the 19th century. It did not address the racial ideologies that the institution of slavery produced. And this is evident in the history of abolitionism in the United States. Many of those who were instrumental in ending slavery, like Abraham Lincoln, did not renounce anti-Black ideology. Once it was unlinked from the institution of slavery, the acceptance and persistence of this ideology gave life to what some scholars have called the afterlives of slavery. In these afterlives, anti-Blackness was simply reconfigured so that the harm of social, civic, and economic marginalization was inflicted upon Black people through evolved mechanisms that were sanctioned by the state, even as slavery was not. As Saidiya Hartman, one very influential scholar in all this, says, from this vantage point, emancipation appears less the grand event of liberation than a point of transition between modes of servitude and racial subjection. Intransigent anti-Black racism ensured that in the aftermath of abolition in the United States and in national contexts throughout the globe, Black people continue to suffer limited life chances and a host of social maladies. As New World slavery gave life to unprecedented material prosperity, it also birthed a potent anti-Blackness that could not be extinguished through mere abolition. But by producing the pupil of the eye metaphor, which gave favor to those targeted by anti-Blackness, Baha'u'llah made it clear that in any belief, institution, or social movement that was to be compatible with his sacred order, made it clear that any belief, institution, or social movement that was to be compatible with his sacred order could not abide by the insidious ideology that grew out of and outlived New World permutations of institutionalized slavery. The pervasive quality of modernity's anti-Blackness makes it a serious impediment to the development of the loving, equitable, and just human society that is the ultimate aim of Baha'u'llah's revelation. He has explained that those aligned with divine will must be driven by the desire to, quote, quench the flame of hatred and enmity so that the whole earth may come to be viewed as one country. In further elucidating his own mission, Baha'u'llah states, the prophets of God should be regarded as physicians whose task is to foster the well-being of the world and its peoples, that through a spirit of oneness, they may heal the sickness of a divided humanity. Obviously, the anti-Black ideology that has infected societies for several centuries is a constituent element of the humanity dividing sickness that Baha'u'llah's revelation aims to heal. In its most virulent forms, anti-Blackness has marginalized Black life out of existence. That is to say, It promotes social conditions in which disregard or disdain for Black life is so intense that the social and civic body is unperturbed by or even desirous of the mortal expulsion of Black people. Through his pupil of the eye metaphor, which adamantly centers Black life in the figurative body of humanity, Baha'u'llah acted as social physician, prescribing a spiritual and social concept that could be regarded as something more, that must be regarded as something more than a gesture of comfort or solace for historically burdened people. Baha'u'llah's specific and explicit refutation of one of modernity's most hateful and divisive social ideologies is an instructive prescription addressed to all humanity. Surely, the condition of oneness that is global society's highest and most urgent aspiration is impossible without the universal internalization of the medicine that Baha'u'llah has loaded into the pupil of the eye metaphor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for that deep, profound, thought-provoking analysis of Baha'u'llah's metaphor. I'm sure we have many questions. The chat box is available now, the Q&A. If you'd like to put your questions in there. Really a heartfelt thanks to you for this really amazing presentation. Before we actually go to Q&A, if we can, I wanted to share that this webinar is just to give us a taste of the upcoming course that the Wilmette Institute is offering at GTU, Reconstructing Blackness, Anti-Racism and Unity in the U.S. I don't know if you have a few words to share about it, or
Sure,
yeah. Just maybe some of the topics. I can't see them so well right now, but from my memory, the first part that was just covered was one unit of the, many units there are. So construction of race, but then as you can see, there are many more amazing topics that'll be covered. One of which, I hope it's okay, Derik, that I'll just finish up with this so we can take Q&A. Constructive resilience is one of the important themes that goes towards a solutionary, understanding of where we can go once we know history, once we understand and unpack what can we do to create a new reality. And Dr. Smith actually has a new article coming out on that topic, which our director, Robert Stockman, just let us know is forthcoming in one of his books. Stephen Zapeta, if you are there, I would like to share the quote that you gave permission for us to share. Dr. Smith, do you mind scrolling up? I wanted to, Stephen was here in the beginning. I don't know if he's here now, but Stephen has a special place in my heart because he was our first GTU student. And after he took the course, he said, "This course had made me realize that the principles of humanity's oneness, constructive resilience, and consultation are crucial components of the multimodal solutions for racism." So this will be available on our website. Also, GTU signups, you know where to go on SONUS. And for UC Berkeley signups, please email me at C. Golestani. If we could scroll down just a little bit more, C. Golestani at wilmetteinstitute.org. I'll put it in the chat box. So that whoever is interested in taking our upcoming courses at the GTU will know just how to do that. Thank you so much. We're ready for a Q&A, so let's go and see what we have. Okay, so the first question: in origin, white and black, and even country of origin are value-free, neutral. How did black, brown, darker become the enslaved, subjected, and white, pale, lighter become the enslaver subjector. It would have gone the other, it could have gone the other way. How did one become the colonizer and the other colonized?
Thanks for that question. I mean, this is a kind of, I think that's a question about like sort of like the trajectory of human history. Why did, one population have certain kinds of social and material advantages at a point in history that allowed them to enslave another population? And of course, most scholars would attribute this to certain kinds of political and power dynamics that unfolded over the course of human history, such that in the thinking that I was focused on in terms of what we call New World slavery, Europeans had certain kinds of technologies and political sort of structures in place that made it possible for them to intervene into sort of Western Africa and begin to enslave the people of that region of the world. This is a kind of a massive kind of question. And, there's this a kind of book from when I was younger that attempted to kind of answer that, in this broad sort of historically sweeping account of the modern world called, I think it's called Guns, Germs, and Steels by Diamond. And, I mean, there's all these kinds of climate, he goes back into sort of climate and political history in order to sort of make an argument for how the organization of humanity unfolded such that Europeans ended up being the colonizers of the New World and the enslavers of Africans in that New World period.
Thank you so much. There are a few questions, but because we have just a few minutes left, I'm going to choose one that has to do with the way forward. What does it look like to focus in the light of Baha'u'llah's teachings on the issue of racial prejudice in America today? What are some examples of practical action centered on those spiritual precepts that we can engage in and promote today in our communities and society?
So one of the strategies and sort of philosophies that come out of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, and which is being advanced by different populations throughout the world to deal with the realities of oppression, is that of constructive resilience. So, and this is one segment of the course that will be offered at GTU. So the strategy of social transformation that is embedded into this idea of constructive resilience is one in which oppositionalism and conflict is eschewed in favor of an approach of community building, which tries to bring people together, tries to create power through mutualism, through the bringing together of like-minded people who are desirous of building societies through relationships that are characterized by justice and unity and love and compassion. And rather than positioning themselves in opposition to existing social forces, are more concentrated on the bringing together of people in a kind of community building process that welcomes everyone who is willing to try to work for social change using principles of love, justice, and equity. So I think that the Baha'i community throughout the world and in the United States is making concerted efforts to create communities in which the most marginalized are welcomed and embraced by all, and that there is a kind of coherence of thought and action which is attentive to the terrible oppressions that exist in some place like the United States, but elsewhere in the world, and are gathering together people in a pattern of community life that is characterized not by oppositionalism and conflict and contention with others, but by an effort to create bonds of unity and love between people. And this is happening, in communities throughout the United States. Every locality is involved in a community building process in which Baha'is abide by, these kinds of principles.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to fit in one or two more questions. We might go just a few minutes over. Ada asks, what is a healthy way to cope as a Black person in anti-Black society?
Well, I mean, I think that this is a very difficult kind of question. And for each individual, there may be different ways of approaching it. I think that many of the kinds of the social milieu, like the social reality that we live in, creates harms for us in all kinds of ways. We are exposed to ideas and to thoughts that are oppressive all the time. We are exposed to dangers presented by society, by the state. And so that becomes a kind of a very serious burden for a lot of Black people. And of course, that's manifest in the kinds of the prevalence of certain kinds of medical conditions like, cardiovascular issues and high levels of stress and so forth that Black people are enduring with. So to my mind, what is necessary is a kind of, spiritual vision, of course, in which people attempt to gain some kind of comfort through a relationship. Again, this is only my own perspective, with divinity, with a spiritual reality. And as we do that, we cannot do that without engaging material reality, right? So from a Baha'i perspective, there is a twofold moral path. One that involves the refinement and development of the inner spiritual world, and another which involves engagement with the society in which we live. And so I think that, as difficult as it may be, that there is a kind of there is a healthiness, there's a healthy quality, there's a healthy element to trying to make social change, even as we simultaneously take care of ourselves spiritually. And this is a Baha'i principle that, again, is sometimes called a twofold moral path, that these two things can't happen without the other. We must be attentive to our spiritual realities and those things that are uplifting to our souls, right? And at the same time, we must engage in social action, which is attempting to uplift people who are suffering in a material reality and creating a better society for everyone involved. And so those, for anyone, and I think particularly for Black people, of course, this twofold moral path is how I see the best way for us to move forward.
Indeed, they're interconnected, being and doing, right? I think our bonus question of the night, which we'll end with, because I think only you could answer this one. Could you speak to the power of Robert Hayden's poetry and his ability to be a pupil of the eye?
So for those people who don't know, Robert Hayden was a very important American poet of the middle decades of the 20th century. He was also a Black Baha'i, and he wrote very powerfully about his experience as both a Black person in America and his spiritual commitment to the faith of Baha'u'llah. One of the things that he was committed to was a kind of excellence of craft. And in that excellence of craft, part part of that was this incredible observation of the realities of his day and age. And he was able to observe the social reality and his own experience of it. And then I would say, craft it, hone it into poetry, which is exquisite in its craftsmanship. He was committed to the principle of the oneness of humanity, even as he was simultaneously had experienced incredible hardships due to poverty and due to anti-Blackness. And yet, despite all that, he still held out faith that there was the possibility of a unified humanity at some point in the future. And he committed himself spiritually and in his vocation to the advancement of the work of the Baha'i Faith and to gaining a greater understanding of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, who in one of his poems he calls the cosmic hero. This is how he viewed Baha'u'llah. And so, yeah, Robert Hayden is a great artist of the 20th century, and also a great Baha'i and African-American Baha'i as well.
Dr. Smith, I think we can have you for hours. I would love to have all these questions answered, but I guess I can say that Dr. Gwen Etter-Lewis might pick up some of these themes in the course, upcoming course. Please feel free to write us. I put my email in the chat, cgolestani@wilmetinstitute.org, anything about tonight's program or the upcoming courses at GTU. Really, I think, Derik Smith, your work is groundbreaking because it is something that helps people understand how revolutionary the replacement of anti-Blackness can be with the central theme of pupil of the eye. And we know that in the Baha'i writings, the unity between African American and European Americans is a prerequisite to world peace. And so your contribution in helping us unpack that, helping us understand that, is highly prized and appreciated. I know you're immensely busy. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us tonight. Thank you to all the participants who made time to be here with us tonight. We hope you'll join us for the following webinars we'll have with GTU, and join us in thanking Dr. Smith tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Golestani. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who joined in.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the evening.